I call them solid light pieces primarily because there is this paradox. When you first encounter the works, you see something made of veils of light that looks quite stable, solid, and almost like it's a thing. And something that almost everybody does, even people who've been to them repeatedly, everybody does is to reach up with their hand and to feel the plane of light. So paradoxically, it's quite tactile. Even, of course, your touch reveals that there's nothing there. Nonetheless, your imagination insists that there is something that's quite solid and quite palpable. These solid light projections do have these two faces. They exist as a sculptural form, a three-dimensional volumetric object which you can walk around, go into and explore. But when you turn around, you also see that that volumetric form derives from a two-dimensional drawing. And one thing I discovered very early on is that if you project onto a wall drawings, like a movie, an animated movie, you can have very, very complex forms interacting with one another and superimposed on one another, and we have no difficulty deciphering what we're looking at. But if you were to project one of those animations as a solid light piece, you would find that the three-dimensional spaces created by those intersecting lines is too complex for the eyes and the body to decipher. So they become incomprehensible. And I found from very early on that very simple lines made the most interesting three-dimensional objects. In the 70s, all my solid light works were horizontal. This was, of course, normal because they were working, it came out of cinema. Film projectors were designed to sit flat on tables and produce horizontal images on the wall. But when I began working again in the beginning of 2001 or 2 or something like that, of course I was working with new kinds of projectors, digital projectors, and I quickly realized that they were not gravity bound like a film projector. And I began to explore vertical projections and became increasingly interested by the way in which they aligned themselves much more with a sculptural tradition than with a cinematic tradition, because one began to think of them as vertical figures, standing figures, not in a pictorial sense, but they remind you of the verticality of sculpted bodies. These works do sit midway between two very big categories, sculpture on the one hand, cinema on the other. Sculpture because of the three-dimensional aspect and the fact that they exist in three-dimensional space along with the spectator. And cinema because the pieces are themselves slowly changing in time. So there is a kind of a development, a form of progression which occurs as you're looking. There are a number of paradoxes. They appear to be solid even though they're made of light. They appear to be motionless, even in fact, as you can see that they're changing repeatedly through time. So yes, time is the fundamental medium, perhaps.